The train pulled into Grand Central Terminal on the morning of November 14, 1903, 40 minutes past schedule. Among the passengers who descended onto the platform was a man named Samuel Horace Venner, age 32, whose appearance would be described in 3 separate witness statements with remarkable consistency: gaunt, clean-shaven where he had previously worn a beard, and carrying only a canvas rucksack that appeared nearly empty. His sister, Margaret Venner Talmadge, was waiting for him. She had been waiting for 11 days. According to her testimony, given to the New York City Police Department on November 16th and preserved in the municipal archives, her brother stepped off the train, looked directly at her and said nothing. She embraced him. He did not resist, but neither did he return the gesture. His arms, she noted, remained at his sides. "I asked him where the others were," Margaret stated. "He looked at me as if I had asked him to explain the nature of God. Then he shook his head once and walked past me toward the street. The others numbered 4. Dr. Philip Carstairs, 41, a geologist from Columbia University. James Doucette, 28, a photographer whose work had appeared in Harper's Weekly. Peter Greenwald, 35, a surveyor employed by the Department of the Interior. And Thomas Venner, 29, Samuel's younger brother. All 4 had departed New York on October 21, 1903, alongside Samuel, bound for the Adirondack wilderness on what was described in the expedition prospectus as a geological and photographic survey of the Northern Lakes region, with particular attention to mineral deposits and forest composition. Samuel Horace Venner returned alone. The first official inquiry began within hours of his arrival. A patrolman named Dennis Coyle, acting on a report filed by Margaret Talmadge, arrived at the Venner family home on East 67th Street at approximately 2 o'clock that afternoon. His incident report, written in the careful hand of a man uncomfortable with paperwork, describes Samuel seated in a wingback chair near the parlor window, staring at the street below. "I asked Mr. Venner to account for the whereabouts of his companions," Coyle wrote. "He did not answer. I repeated the question. He turned his head toward me and said, very clearly, 'I will not speak of it.' I informed him that this was a matter of legal concern and that the families of the missing men deserved answers. He said, 'I know what they deserve. I cannot give it.'" Coyle noted that Samuel's hands were bandaged. When asked about the injuries, Samuel held them up briefly, examined them as if seeing them for the first time, and lowered them again without comment. A second interview was conducted the following day by Detective Arthur Brennan of the Missing Persons Bureau, a unit newly formed within the NYPD to handle the city's growing number of unresolved disappearances. Brennan was known as a patient man, skilled in extracting confessions through attrition rather than aggression. He spent 4 hours with Samuel Venner. His report summarized the encounter in a single paragraph. Subject refuses all substantive questions regarding the expedition. States repeatedly that he will not say. When pressed on the moral obligation to the families, subject closed his eyes and remained silent for the duration of the interview. No confession obtained, no useful intelligence gathered. Recommend escalation to district attorney if subject does not comply within 1 week. That escalation never occurred. The families of the missing men, Philip Carstairs' elderly mother in Boston, James Doucette's wife and infant daughter in Brooklyn, Peter Greenwald's 2 sisters in Philadelphia, and Samuel's own parents, who had already lost 1 son and could not comprehend why the other would not explain how, each made personal appeals. Letters were written, visits were arranged. Samuel Venner refused them all. On November 23rd, 9 days after his return, the New York Sun ran a short article on page 4 under the headline, "Adirondack Expedition Ends in Mystery. One survivor refuses to account for missing companions." The article was restrained, almost sympathetic in its tone, noting that Mr. Venner appeared to be suffering from a severe disturbance of the nerves and had been placed under the care of a private physician. That physician, Dr. Leonard Hastings, kept his own notes. A portion of his case file, donated to the New York Academy of Medicine in 1947, survives. In an entry dated November 25, 1903, Dr. Hastings wrote, Patient exhibits no signs of mania, delirium, or dissociative disorder. He is lucid, responsive to simple questions regarding his physical health, and aware of his surroundings. When the subject of the expedition is raised, he does not become agitated. He simply stops speaking. It is not refusal born of defiance. It is refusal born of something I can only describe as resolve. By December, the story had faded from public view. The families continued to press for answers, but without Samuel's cooperation, no legal action could proceed. The 4 men were declared missing. Search parties had been dispatched into the Adirondacks in mid-November, but early snow and the vastness of the region made any organized effort nearly impossible. Nothing was found. No bodies, no evidence of a camp, no indication of where the men had gone or what had befallen them. Samuel Venner lived quietly in the family home for another 3 years. He did not work. He did not marry. He rarely left the house. On the few occasions when he was seen in public, usually walking alone in Central Park or attending church with his mother, witnesses described him as polite but unreachable, a man who had built a wall between himself and the world and had no intention of dismantling it. In 1906, he moved to a small town in Vermont, a place called Halesford, where he took a position as a clerk in a dry goods store. He remained there for the rest of his life. He never returned to New York. He never contacted the families of the missing men. And he never, in the 41 years between his return and his death in 1944, spoke publicly about what happened in the Adirondacks in the autumn of 1903. But silence, as any historian knows, is not the absence of a story. It is the presence of one too difficult to tell. Block 2. Before the event. In the summer of 1903, Samuel Horace Venner was employed as a junior clerk at the law firm of Whitmore, Cass and Dunlap, a mid-tier practice specializing in property disputes and estate planning. He was, by all accounts, unremarkable, methodical, punctual, neither ambitious nor complacent. He lived with his parents and his younger brother, Thomas, in a brownstone on the Upper East Side that had been in the family for 2 generations. Thomas Venner was, in every way Samuel was not, remarkable. Letters between the brothers, preserved in the collection of the New York Historical Society, reveal a relationship built on affection and mutual reliance, though unequal in its dynamics. Thomas was the younger by 3 years, but the correspondence suggests he was the more confident, the more adventurous, the one who initiated and Samuel who followed. In a letter dated June 3, 1903, Thomas wrote to Samuel, "You worry too much about what father thinks. He will always think we should be lawyers or bankers or something equally tedious. But we're young enough still to do something worth remembering. Trust me on this." The something worth remembering was the Adirondack expedition. Thomas had conceived of it after meeting Dr. Philip Carstairs at a lecture on mineralogy hosted by the American Museum of Natural History. Carstairs, a geologist with a growing reputation for his work on quartz deposits, had mentioned in passing that certain regions of the Adirondacks remained largely unexplored from a geological standpoint. Thomas, always eager to attach himself to men of learning and reputation, approached Carstairs after the lecture and proposed a collaborative venture, a small, privately funded expedition to survey the northern lakes, document mineral formations, and produce a photographic record of the wilderness. Carstairs agreed, provided the expedition included a qualified surveyor and photographer. Thomas recruited Peter Greenwald, a surveyor he had met through business acquaintances, and James Doucette, a photographer whose portraits of New York's tenement children had earned him modest acclaim. Samuel was invited as the 5th member, not because of any particular skill, but because Thomas insisted. "I need someone I can rely on," Thomas wrote in a letter dated August 12th. "The others are capable men, but they're strangers to me. You're my brother. That counts for more than competence." Samuel, who had never expressed any interest in geology, photography, or wilderness exploration, accepted. The months leading up to the departure were consumed with preparation. The expedition was to last 3 weeks, beginning in late October when the autumn colors would provide ideal conditions for photography and the weather would still permit travel. The plan was to hire local guides in the town of Saranac Lake, establish a base camp near one of the larger bodies of water, and conduct day-long surveys radiating outward. Letters from this period reveal no tension among the men. Carstairs wrote to a colleague that he found the Venner brothers amiable if inexperienced, and expressed confidence that Greenwald and Doucette would provide the necessary technical expertise. Doucette's wife, in a letter to her sister dated October 10th, mentioned that her husband was excited as a child about the opportunity to photograph landscapes that few had documented. There were no premonitions, no warnings, no sense that anything was amiss. On October 21, 1903, the 5 men boarded a northbound train at Grand Central. Margaret Talmadge, Samuel's sister, saw them off. In her later testimony, she recalled that Thomas was in high spirits, joking with Doucette about the quality of the sandwiches Margaret had packed for the journey. Samuel, she said, seemed quieter than usual but not troubled. I kissed them both goodbye, she stated. Thomas said, "Don't worry, Maggie. We'll be back before you know it." Samuel just nodded. I remember thinking he looked tired. The train arrived in Saranac Lake on the afternoon of October 22nd. The men checked into a boarding house run by a widow named Clara Jennings, who would later provide one of the few detailed accounts of their behavior in the days before they departed for the wilderness. Mrs. Jennings described them as courteous and well-organized. They had maps spread across the dining table every evening, she recalled. Dr. Carstairs did most of the talking. The younger Venner boy, Thomas, was full of energy, always asking questions. The older one, Samuel, mostly listened. He was polite but reserved. I got the sense he wasn't entirely comfortable. On October 25th, the men hired 2 local guides, a man named Joseph Terrell, age 54, and his son, Joseph Jr., age 22. The Terrells were experienced woodsmen, familiar with the northern lakes and the risks of autumn travel in the region. They agreed to lead the expedition to a remote area near Long Lake, establish a camp, and remain with the party for the duration of the survey. But on the morning of October 26th, the arrangement fell apart. Joseph Terrell, according to a statement he gave to the Essex County Sheriff's Office in November, arrived at the boarding house at dawn to find that the expedition had already left. They were gone, Terrell stated. Paid me half what we'd agreed on and left a note saying they'd decided to proceed without guides. I thought it was damned foolish, but it wasn't my business to stop them. The note, preserved in the county archives, was written in a neat, measured hand, identified by Margaret Talmadge as Samuel's. Mr. Terrell, we have reconsidered the necessity of guides and have decided to proceed independently. Enclosed is compensation for your time and trouble. With respect, S. Venner. Why the expedition chose to go forward without experienced guides remains unclear. Mrs. Jennings noted that there had been a conversation the previous evening between Carstairs and the Terrells, but she could not hear what was said. Terrell himself claimed he had no idea what prompted the decision. What is clear is that on the morning of October 26, 1903, 5 men left Saranac Lake on foot, carrying their supplies, maps, and camera equipment, heading northwest into a wilderness they did not fully understand, and only one of them would return. The last confirmed sighting of the 5 men together occurred on October 28, 1903, at approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon. A trapper named Horace Lund, working his lines near the eastern shore of Long Lake, encountered the party as they made their way along a narrow trail that parallels the water. In a statement given to Sheriff William Hackett of Essex County on November 18th, Lund described the men as in good spirits, though tired. They were carrying heavy packs, Lund recalled. I asked if they were lost. The tall one, Dr. Carstairs, I learned later, said they were fine, just looking for a place to camp for the night. I told them there was a clearing about a mile north near the inlet. Good spot, sheltered. He thanked me. That was the last I saw of them. Lund was asked if any of the men seemed distressed or in conflict. He said no. They seemed like any group of city men trying to play at being woodsmen. A little out of their depth maybe, but nothing unusual. After that encounter, the historical record goes silent. No further sightings were reported. No other witnesses came forward. The clearing Lund mentioned was located by search parties in mid-November, and evidence of a recent camp was found, the remnants of a fire pit, several stakes that might have supported a tent, and a tin cup stamped with the initials PG, Peter Greenwald. But there were no bodies, no signs of struggle, no indication of what happened next. The terrain in that region of the Adirondacks is unforgiving. Dense forest gives way to rocky outcroppings and sudden drops. The lakes are deep and cold, and the weather in late October is unpredictable. Early snow is common. Fog settles in the low places and does not lift for days. It is easy to become disoriented. Easier still to make a single mistake. A misstep, a miscalculation of distance, a failure to account for the cold, and not survive it. But 5 men do not simply vanish. The timeline between October 28th and November 4th, the date Samuel Venner arrived alone at the Saranac Lake train station, is a void. 6 days, 144 hours. What happened during that time is known only to Samuel, and he would never say. What is known is this. On November 4th at approximately 9 o'clock in the morning, Samuel appeared at the Saranac Lake train station. He was alone. His clothing was torn and stained. His hands were wrapped in what appeared to be strips of cloth, later identified as pieces of his own shirt. He purchased a ticket to New York City, paid in cash, and boarded the southbound train without speaking to anyone beyond the ticket agent. The agent, a man named Harold Pitts, remembered him clearly. He looked like he'd been through hell. Pitts stated, "I asked if he needed a doctor. He said no. I asked if he was traveling alone. He just looked at me and didn't answer. I figured he was in some kind of trouble, but it wasn't my place to press." Samuel's rucksack, which had been full of supplies when the expedition departed, was nearly empty. Inside were a water canteen, a small journal with only the first 3 pages filled in, entries describing the train journey and the arrival in Saranac Lake, nothing more, and a pocket watch that had belonged to Thomas Venner. The watch was later identified by Margaret Talmadge. She confirmed it had been a gift from their father on Thomas's 21st birthday. Samuel had been carrying it when he returned. No other personal effects belonging to the missing men were found in Samuel's possession. No cameras, no surveying instruments, no maps, no letters. When questioned about the journal, Samuel stated only that he had stopped writing after the 3rd day. When asked why, he gave no answer. The search parties that entered the Adirondacks in mid-November faced conditions that had worsened considerably since the expedition's departure. Snow had begun to fall in earnest. The trails were obscured. The lakes were beginning to freeze. Despite the efforts of over 30 men, including the Terrells, local law enforcement, and volunteers from surrounding towns, the search yielded almost nothing. A second campsite was located approximately 3 miles northwest of the clearing mentioned by Horace Lund. It showed signs of recent use, but it was impossible to determine when it had been occupied or by whom. A torn piece of canvas, possibly from a tent, was found snagged on a tree branch. And at the edge of a steep ravine, searchers found a single boot, waterlogged and caked in mud, that was later identified by Mrs. Doucette as belonging to her husband. The boot was found at the bottom of the ravine, approximately 40 feet below the trail. No body was recovered. The search was called off on November 30th due to weather. Plans were made to resume in the spring, but when the snow melted and the search parties returned in May of 1904, they found nothing new. The wilderness had reclaimed whatever evidence might have existed. The official report, filed by Sheriff Hackett and forwarded to the New York State Police, concluded that the 4 men had likely perished due to exposure, accidental injury, or a combination of both, and that their bodies were either concealed by the terrain or had been carried off by animals. The report noted that Samuel Venner's refusal to cooperate had severely hampered the investigation, but stopped short of accusing him of any wrongdoing. There was no evidence of foul play. There was also no evidence of anything else. In the absence of answers, speculation filled the void. Some believed the men had become lost and succumbed to the cold. Others suggested an accident, a fall, a drowning, a sudden illness. A few whispered darker possibilities, that the men had turned on each other that Samuel had survived by abandoning the others, that something terrible had occurred and he was complicit in it. But these were only whispers. Samuel Venner, for his part, said nothing to confirm or deny any of it. He simply carried his silence like a stone and refused to set it down. The pressure on Samuel Venner did not come all at once. It came in waves, each one more insistent than the last, and he met each with the same unyielding refusal. The first wave came from the families. Philip Carstairs' mother, Eudora, traveled from Boston to New York in late November. She was 73 years old, a widow, and her son had been her only living child. She arrived at the Venner home unannounced, and according to Margaret Talmadge's account, was received in the parlor by Samuel himself. Mrs. Carstairs' own recollection of the visit, recorded in a letter to a friend dated December 2nd, 1903, describes an encounter that was brief and devastating in its restraint. "I asked him to tell me what became of my Philip," she wrote. "He looked at me with such sadness that I thought for a moment he might weep. But he did not. He said only, 'I cannot tell you, ma'am. I wish I could.' I begged him. I told him I was an old woman and would not live much longer, and that I deserved to know how my son died. He closed his eyes and said, 'You do deserve to know, but I cannot give you what you deserve.'" Mrs. Carstairs left the house and never returned. She died in 1907, still waiting for an answer that never came. James Doucet's wife, Anne, made no personal visit. She could not. She had an infant daughter to care for, and no means to travel. Instead, she wrote letters, dozens of them, pleading with Samuel to provide any detail, any clue, anything that might allow her to understand what had happened to her husband. Only one of Samuel's responses survives, preserved in the Doucet family papers and donated to the Brooklyn Historical Society in 1962. It is dated December 10th, 1903, and reads in full, "Mrs. Doucet, I received your letter. I understand your pain. I cannot ease it. I will not speak of what occurred. This is not cruelty. It is all I can offer. With sorrow, S. Venner." Anne Doucet remarried in 1909. She never spoke publicly about the expedition or about Samuel Venner. Peter Greenwald's sisters, Rebecca and Naomi, took a different approach. They hired an attorney, a man named Edward Strauss, who on their behalf petitioned the New York courts to compel Samuel to testify in a formal inquest. The petition argued that Samuel's refusal constituted obstruction of justice and that he should be held in contempt if he did not cooperate. The petition was denied. The judge, in a brief written opinion, noted that while Samuel's silence was regrettable and morally troubling, there was no evidence that a crime had been committed and therefore no legal basis to compel testimony. "A man cannot be forced to speak," the judge wrote, "simply because others wish him to." Strauss appealed. The appeal was denied. The Greenwald sisters eventually ceased their efforts. In a letter dated March 1905, Rebecca Greenwald wrote to a cousin, "We will never know what happened to Peter. That man, Samuel Venner, has locked the truth away, and we have no key. I do not forgive him, but I am too tired to fight any more." The second wave of pressure came from the press. Though the initial coverage had been restrained, by early 1904 the story had begun to attract more attention. The New York World, always eager for sensational material, ran a feature on February 8th under the headline, "The Man Who Will Not Speak. What Did Samuel Venner See in the Adirondack Wilderness?" The article was speculative, breathless, and largely fabricated. It suggested that the men had discovered something in the wilderness, gold perhaps, or evidence of criminal activity, and that Samuel had murdered his companions to claim it for himself. There was no evidence for any of this. The article cited sources close to the investigation that did not exist. Samuel did not respond. Other papers picked up the story. The New York Tribune ran a more measured piece, interviewing Sheriff Hackett and Mrs. Jennings, but even this article concluded with the observation that Mr. Venner's continued silence raises more questions than it answers. Samuel did not respond to this either. In April of 1904, a reporter from the Evening Sun managed to intercept Samuel outside his home. The reporter, A young man named Charles Fitzroy later recounted the encounter in an unpublished memoir discovered in his estate papers in 1979. "I approached him on the street," Fitzroy wrote. "I identified myself and asked if he would be willing to make a statement. He stopped walking and looked at me. I will never forget his expression. It was not anger. It was not fear. It was something closer to pity. He said, 'You want a story. I understand that, but I will not give you one.' I asked why. He said, 'Because some stories should not be told.' Then he walked away." Fitzroy noted that he considered pursuing Samuel further but decided against it. "There was something in his bearing that convinced me he meant what he said. He was not hiding the truth out of shame or guilt. He was protecting it. From what, I could not say." By mid-1904, the press had largely moved on. The story was exhausted. There were no new developments, no dramatic revelations. Samuel Venner remained silent, and silence, it turned out, made for poor copy. The third wave came from within. Samuel's parents, Horace and Catherine Venner, had lost one son and could not comprehend the silence of the other. In a letter dated May 15, 1904, written by Catherine to her sister in Philadelphia, the depth of her anguish is almost unbearable to read. "Samuel will not speak to us of Thomas," she wrote. "He will not say how Thomas died, or where, or whether he suffered. I have asked him 100 times. He only shakes his head and says he cannot. His father is beside himself. He believes Samuel is hiding something shameful, something that would disgrace us. I do not know what to believe. I only know that I have lost both my sons. One is dead, and the other is a ghost." Horace Venner, a partner in a small investment firm, became increasingly withdrawn. His professional correspondence from this period shows a man struggling to maintain focus. In a letter to a business associate dated June 1904, he wrote, "I find I cannot concentrate as I once did. My thoughts return constantly to my boys. I have no answers. I do not know if I ever will." Samuel continued to live in the family home, but the atmosphere was poisonous. Margaret Talmadge, who visited frequently, later described the household as a place of mourning without resolution. Samuel took his meals alone. He did not attend family gatherings. He spoke only when necessary and never about the expedition. In 1906, as previously noted, he left. He told his parents he was moving to Vermont and would not be returning. His departure was sudden, his explanation minimal. He packed a single trunk, said goodbye to his mother, and left the city. Horace Venner died in 1908, Catherine in 1912. Neither ever learned what happened to Thomas. The final wave, perhaps the most persistent, came from Samuel himself. Dr. Leonard Hastings, the physician who treated Samuel in the months following his return, kept detailed notes on his patient's mental state. In an entry dated January 1905, Hastings wrote, "Patient suffers from chronic insomnia and recurring dreams. He will not describe the content of these dreams, but they cause him significant distress. He wakes often, sometimes several times a night. When asked if speaking about the expedition might alleviate this distress, he becomes agitated and states that speaking would make it worse. I am convinced he believes this to be true." Hastings noted that Samuel was not suicidal, not delusional, and not incapable of functioning. But he was, in Hastings' assessment, a man at war with his own memory, and losing. Yet Samuel did not break. He moved to Vermont. He took a quiet job. He lived a life that was, by all outward measures, unremarkable. He attended church. He paid his rent. He was known in Halesford as courteous and reliable, if somewhat solitary. And he never spoke. Not to friends, not to colleagues, not to the few journalists who, over the years, tracked him down and tried one last time to extract the story. In 1927, a young historian named Paul Devereux, working on a dissertation about early 20th century wilderness expeditions, wrote to Samuel requesting an interview. Samuel's reply, dated March 3, 1927, was polite and final. "Mr. Devereux, I appreciate your interest in the subject, but I will not be able to assist you. The events of 1903 are not a matter I discuss, and this will not change. I wish you well in your research. S. Venner." Devereux did not press further. By the 1930s, the story had been largely forgotten. The families had moved on or passed away. The press had found other mysteries. The Adirondacks remained vast and indifferent, keeping whatever secrets they held. And Samuel Venner, now in his 60s, continued his quiet life in Vermont, carrying a silence that had become as much a part of him as his name. Samuel Horace Venner died on March 11, 1944 in Halesford, Vermont, at the age of 72. The cause of death was pneumonia. He was found in his small rented room above the dry goods store, where he had worked for 38 years. He died alone. His few possessions were inventoried by the town clerk: clothing, a Bible, several books on history and geography, a pocket watch engraved with the initials TV, and a small wooden box containing letters from his sister Margaret, spanning 4 decades. There was no journal, no written confession, no document explaining what had happened in the Adirondacks in the autumn of 1903. Margaret Talmadge, then 76 and living in Boston, was notified of her brother's death by telegram. She traveled to Vermont to arrange for his burial. In a letter to a friend, dated March 20th, 1944, she wrote, "I buried Samuel next to a stone wall in a small cemetery outside of town. It is a quiet place. He would have liked it. I stood there for a long time, hoping that death might have released whatever he had carried all these years. But I think he took it with him. She never learned what it was." In the years since Samuel's death, the story of the 1903 Adirondack expedition has occasionally resurfaced, examined by historians and amateur researchers drawn to the mystery of it. The physical evidence remains sparse. A few newspaper clippings, witness statements, letters, and the cryptic refusal of a man who survived when others did not. There are theories, of course. There always are. Some have suggested that the men became separated during a storm, and that Samuel, unable to find them, was forced to save himself. This would explain his silence as a product of guilt. Survivor's guilt, the burden of having lived while others perished through no fault of his own, yet feeling responsible nonetheless. Others propose that an accident occurred, a fall, a drowning, and that Samuel witnessed something so traumatic that his mind could not process it, and his silence was a form of psychological self-preservation. A darker hypothesis suggests that conflict arose among the men, that desperation or fear led to violence, and that Samuel's refusal to speak was an attempt to protect the reputations of the dead, or perhaps to shield himself from implications he could not bear to articulate. And then, there are those who believe that Samuel saw something, experienced something, that was so far outside the normal bounds of human experience that language itself failed him. Not supernatural, but profoundly disorienting, a confrontation with mortality or nature or human frailty that rendered speech inadequate. But these are only theories. The truth is that we do not know. We cannot know. What we do know is this: Samuel Venner was not a man prone to dramatics. He was not a liar. He was not, by any account, cruel or vindictive. The people who knew him in Vermont described him as kind, if distant. He helped his neighbors. He attended funerals. He was, in the words of one acquaintance, a man who had learned to live with sorrow. The refusal to speak was not, I believe, an act of cowardice or evasion. It was a choice, deliberate and sustained over 4 decades, made at great personal cost. The pressure he faced, from families, from the law, from the press, from his own parents, was immense. He could have eased that pressure at any time by simply speaking. He did not. Why? I have spent considerable time with the available records, and I have come to believe that Samuel's silence was an act of protection, not of himself, but of others. Perhaps he understood that the truth, whatever it was, would not bring comfort to the families. Perhaps he believed that some details, how the men died, what they said in their final moments, the choices that were made or not made, were too painful to be spoken aloud, too likely to haunt those left behind. Perhaps he knew that the families wanted answers, but that the answers he could give would be worse than uncertainty. There is a moment, recorded in Margaret Talmadge's testimony, that has stayed with me. It occurred during one of her visits to Samuel in the months after his return. She had asked him, once again, to tell her what happened to Thomas. And Samuel, after a long silence, said, "Maggie, if I told you, you would carry it the way I do, and I will not do that to you." That statement, I think, is as close to an explanation as we will ever get. Samuel Venner knew what had happened. He knew in vivid, unrelenting detail. And he judged that knowledge to be unbearable, not just for him, but for anyone who received it. So he bore it alone. There is a kind of terrible nobility in that. The question, then, is not why Samuel refused to speak. The question is what he was protecting the world from knowing. And that question, like the man who carried its answer, is silent. In the archives of the Essex County Historical Society, there is a photograph taken in Saranac Lake in October of 1903. It shows 5 men standing in front of a boarding house, their packs at their feet, ready to depart. They are smiling. The sun is shining. Thomas Venner has his arm around his brother's shoulder. Samuel is not smiling. He is looking at the camera, but his expression is unreadable. It is the face of a man who does not yet know what he will carry, but who will, in time, learn to carry it without complaint. The photograph was donated to the Society in 1952 by Clara Jennings's daughter, who found it among her mother's effects. On the back, in faded ink, is written, "The Expedition, October 1903. God keep them." 4 of them were not kept, and the one who was kept a silence that no historian, no inquiry, no passage of time has ever broken. Nor should it be. Some truths are not meant to be unearthed. Some stories are not ours to tell. Samuel Venner understood this. He lived with that understanding for 41 years, and he died with it intact. We are left with the outline of a tragedy, the shape of a loss, and the weight of a silence that speaks louder than any words ever could. That, in the end, may be the only truth we are meant to have.